The topic of the roundtable now. Thank you for participating. Still, so the purpose of this roundtable is the place of neuroscience in future research on perpetrators of extreme violence. And let me just, so I will participate, but just as an introduction, let me insist on the word future. So now the roundtable participants are welcome to say what they think about future research. Because as Grete Myrdal said this morning, we do not want this to stop. We have only understood very few things. And so what would be your proposals? This has already been discussed in the previous roundtable, and we have seen a number of themes, approaches, ideas, from which we can eventually make future plans. We have a proposal of President Jean-Paul Costa, who cannot be here today, but who was here in the meeting the 2 days, to do next year in the Institut des Droits de l'Homme in Strasbourg a meeting on neuroscience and law. And this is the Institute of Human Rights, and that's very important because our friends from the law area have not been participating very much in discussions with neuroscience on such topics as la dangerosité, etc. So that is one proposal. Is David Cohen here? No. David Cohen and Michel Bodbol and several pédopsychiatres, together maybe with François Sironi, have told me that they may be interested to continue in a very wide sense, including many other people, to look in the future at the problem of whether people are normal or psychopaths. So this question is could be continued with the participation and initiative of the psychiatrists. We obviously have seen also several themes which will not be driven by disciplines, because we know that it has always has to be a confrontation between disciplines. And so what is your opinion about the way we could go in the future? Why don't I ask ladies first?
I'm the only lady. As usual. No, it's not as usual. But so I guess the future. I have been only here for this conference, so I wasn't part of the past. So I can only infer from what I...
We heard from you that you have already engaged in
yeah, so I guess what we had like some chats in the breaks with Julie Guez and other people who were on the conference, and we thought and we felt that what would be probably really good is if you were to be do a next year step, is to have these more in-depth think tanks where we invite perhaps people who know each other's now a bit, like the background we have already exposed, and then you would like what we just started tackling. We could basically really think of how to explore, for example, in the brain, how top-down things like beliefs, sacred values, identities, how we could induce them, and then see how these basically priors, like top-down priors, influence decision-making and empathy in a way that you can shift, what people from empathic to non-empathic or from empathic to alexithymic through induction of these things. So I guess, for the next step, I would see a more almost like working towards grants or something together, where you really look at how does that work out. So that would be an idea. Just like more, like the Sprungmann forums, they are like a 1-week think tank where people cannot leave the room, and they really need to find solutions. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't leave the room, but they have to find solutions for their questions across disciplines, and it's really, in-depth evaluation of how could these disciplines work together and come out with a certain program even. So that would be one thing. Then perhaps the other thing, you know, I started working on plasticity and intervention, and I completely see the point that we shouldn't do intervention when we don't know whether there is a syndrome or not. But I still think that from what I have heard from the more social scientist side, that there is something really cultural we can do, which is not so much psychopathological, but for example, in the resource project I presented a little bit yesterday, what we do is that we make people, let's say, more conscious for the possible effect of group pressure norms, and you know, like more sensitive for in-group, out-group distinction and how to overcome it. So these kind of mental trainings, I wouldn't say I would immediately put them, you know, with IS combats, because I wouldn't know how to do it. But I think there is a huge benefit of this program to put them into schools and into early education, because I really don't understand how we can educate our children in, you know, math and so on, but the most crucial mental ability, like how to how to regulate stress, how to regulate your emotion, how to be a better understanding of other beliefs, how to educate tolerance, how to make them more flexible in their minds. This is what we can do, and we have the data. We have 90 measures, and I think to think about that as an early prevention of a whole society moving into radicalism or polarization and non-tolerance is something we can do, and this is not dangerous. We don't know about side effects yet. Yeah, so that would be something I would say. This is a starting point.
Okay, so I totally agree with what you just said, especially education and learning to manage emotions and everything like that. It's very important, and it is not well developed in our society. Just, I would like to add something a bit different, is that I think the place of neuroscience in this kind of topic maybe that it could help to understand something which is why it's so difficult for us to understand that people like kamikazes can kill themselves just for something else, for a cause. And we know that it exists. This is a E syndrome, or to perpetrate, I mean, horrible things and so on. And I think this might be because in our Western society, we really reason in terms of what motivates behavior is goal. So we have this notion of goal, which is very important in our society. And the fact that some people actually doesn't seem to match this way of acting according to goals or actual concrete goal is something which may help us to think differently. And what could neuroscience help in this direction is that it could help to understand that in the brain, how the brain actually drives behavior, it might be not related to the notion of goal. So I work on decision making, and I can tell you that we have data that question this notion of goal. That, just to be very brief, we can say that there is no goal in the brain. And but this is an idea. This kind of data are very difficult to publish today in scientific journal, because I remember this data. I tried to publish it, and I got review from referees, and they said, "Okay, you say that there is your data shows that there is no goal." In this kind of conditions, there is no goal that drive people behavior, subject behavior. But I don't really understand the task, because what is really the goal? So there is this kind of circular reasoning. So I think, just to be brief, that neuroscience can help to make some paradigmatic shift in the way we think what drives human behavior. And it's maybe the role of basic science to inform social science about this possibility of paradigmatic shifts, which often in the history of science come from very basic science. For example, you can think about Gödel's theorem in the beginning of the 20th centuries, or many things that come from very basic science and that really change the way actually our society think about themselves.
Thank you. Well, my brain is like a washing machine, because I came this morning to hear people in a round table, and now I am in the round table. So I didn't prepare anything, as it's not very easy, really. Well, the point yes, a challenge. Edmund proposed to put the perpetrators in the machine, and my idea was, well, okay, they may go in the machine, but what are we going to see? And the problem is, I don't think perpetrators have immediate, clear difference in their brains. And there is, I would say, there is a sort of relationship between what addicted people, addicted to drugs of abuse, have in their brains and perpetrators. They're probably submitted to the same type of phenomena. That is, well, I've shown that in mice and rats and so on, there is pleasure to get to kill or to fight, and children like to fight at school. They got this pleasure, and probably education tries to counteract this phenomenon by giving ideas, and religion also would go into this contraction. I mean, if we take the amygdala as a sort of, I don't want to be reductionist, but let's say amygdala is a very important structure to understand what you can do, what you shouldn't do. Of course, all the brain is in the thing, in the circuitry, but maybe amygdala could be interesting. So the problem, if we want to go to the future, how can we modify, can we modify the activity of the modulation of the amygdala? And this is not easy, but probably what happens, and Alain says so about it, is that this modulation is taking place in the very first months and years of life. And what we know now is, when we look at drugs of abuse, addicted people, almost all of them have had difficulties in the development of their first years, and they are extremely vulnerable in the relationship between two of the most important neuromodulators, which are noradrenaline and 5-HT, which dissociate because of drugs. And probably I would say that the pleasure that perpetrators get, it's just because they have not they have desensitized their circuitry of amygdalin circuitry, I would say, altogether. I understand I'm probably quite complex, but I would finish by saying that probably it's not neuroscience which is going to find the solution, but the solution is more in the relationship between the psychoanalyst, for example, or psychologist, and the patient. The patient has to understand what happened to him and what could happen to him. He has to understand that, because psychotherapy will modify the way the brain is constructed, but it's not neuroscience will do the job, but probably the relationship between patient and the psychologist. Sorry for the complexity.
But Jean-Paul, the reason for which you are sitting here is that we have been approaching the problem of drugs late in the project of Itzhak. And therefore, for the future, do you agree that this problem of pharmacology and drug, as you describe in a very interdisciplinary way, should be one of the topics still to be continued? That is our question today.
Yes.
I think we share this I'm not in this field, but this is what we share with Itzhak. That
Yes, there's clearly
somehow this problem of drug should be continued precisely in a very interdisciplinary way, including development, social effects, alcohol, etc.
Yes, my neighbor has just talking about kamikaze, and I had the same idea that he had. That it's incredible to see these people who are going to give their lives in planes to go to the boats and so on. And I recently learned that they were under drugs. Most of them were took drugs before, and probably some people. A lady told me just a few times ago that there is a clear relationship between crime and drugs. People takes others that takes drugs of abuse before, and they modify probably their brain, or they take alcohol, for example, just before the crime. So there is a relationship which is absolutely clear.
And it should be. I think it's maybe worth going into that also, because when we know that drug abuse is such a general social problem.
Yeah.
All right. So. Okay.
But it doesn't happen to everybody. I mean, if in this room, if we give to everybody cocaine, only 14% or 12% of the room would become addicted, because. I'm sorry, that's a percentage. We can try if you want. But we know that. And but if we start smoking tobacco, if everybody in this room is obliged to smoke tobacco, 32% of the room would become addicted. So the products are not the same, the sensitivity are not the same, and probably there is a vulnerability to the crime. Yeah, I mean, if you are in situation, you wouldn't be addicted if you don't meet cocaine. That wouldn't happen. You have to meet cocaine. If you have to meet crime, probably you may become addicted depending on your vulnerability. And probably this crime is extremely addictive, depending on the contact you may have with the possibility to kill.
Thank you, Edmund.
May I add something?
I have
I would like to add something. I think the problem of drug is very important in when the act is done, but still it remains this issue to understand why these people decide to give their life for something, and I think it's not really related to drugs or to modification of the brain at the time of when they perpetrate the crime. I mean, possibly the drug helps this person when they act, not to have this feeling that they are doing something so wrong that they couldn't really act. But still, they decide before that they will go for that. And I'm not sure it is related to the drug effect.
I have 4 suggestions or proposals for this group. The first one is that the tribalism, which I mentioned, hasn't really been incorporated greatly. So I could see it being strengthened by bringing in people from animal behavior who know about tribalism in animals. The point, in brief, is that it looks as if it's natural to be tribal. There would be a genetic advantage into grouping together with other individuals who, in evolutionary history, would have probably been genetically related to you. So we shouldn't regard tribalism per se as being in any sense sort of unnatural. So it's like the building block that terrorism uses. And of course, as people have said, we no longer work with a genetically related group. We're working because of media, social media, with arbitrary groups. So that's my first point, that in a sense, some of this is natural. Second point is, although I talked a lot about emotion and reward value, one of the things that we need more work on is narrative reward value, how ideas rewarding ideas are being expressed in the brain. Are they also orbitofrontal cortex? My guess is yes. We know that words modulate representations there. But what about just narrative reward, words that are producing rewards and so on? We need to know a little bit more about that, okay?
Let me make a comment. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur had described at least three components of identity, which we discussed. Ipséité, same as the other. And he had this third component, which he called the narrative identity, which is extremely interesting.
Yes.
And for those who want to read the book, it's called Soi-même comme un autre, the Paul Ricoeur. Very small book, but extremely interesting for our thinking about the different components of identity, independently of the fMRI imagery.
Thank you. Yes, so that's a very important point, and that's a sort of frontier area for neuroscience that could be developed in the future. Okay. So the third thing is, I mentioned that we have a number of different semi-independent brain systems for producing behavior. So one of them is the goal-directed system, whereby you identify value and then you perform any action to get it. Another one is a habit system, which involves the striatum, where we do much more stimulus-response behaviors, which appears to be what may be happening to some extent when people are committing extremist acts. Another output system is the one that uses reasoning to decide what to do, which I've argued is very important, to see if there are other things than what your emotional system is telling you that may be important. Now, given that we have these different systems, I think more research on how we use one versus another would be very important. And we know much less about that. So I regard that as being a frontier area. Now, what I said was that when we take decisions, there's internal noise in our brain caused by the random spiking of the neurons that influences the decision that we take. But we don't actually know exactly which bit of the brain is taking this decision between which output system we should use, the habit one or the goal-directed value one or the reasoning one. So I see that as being a frontier area. And then my fourth point is that we've heard a lot about bits of the brain, such as the insula and striatum, which are activated in tasks in which one might be empathetic. But it looks as if they're just readout systems. They're just reflecting the sort of net output of the important systems that are taking the computations. That's right. So in a sense, my understanding at the moment is we know remarkably little about the systems that set up long-term values that make us want to be empathetic in the first place. And my understanding, I'll be interested to see what Tania says to this, is that that is almost totally unexplored. So what we're really looking at is just if you give people different instructions at the output of the system, but not at how people are really taking these decisions based on their value systems about what to do. And we don't really know how the value systems are being built in the first place. Now, how they're being built may not be entirely a neuroscience question. So I think this is truly multidisciplinary. We need to understand how the value systems are being built and then also which parts of the brain they're implemented in. So those would be my suggestions. But you know, there may be some discussion. But let me say I'm looking forward to hearing what Itzhak Fried thinks about these issues in terms of brain, because he's a brain man.
Okay, well, I think first of all, I think we've gotten some very concrete insights, during those two or three days. I think conceptually we are really facing two sort of issues. One is the issue of mind and brain, which is still, people are on various points in this spectrum. Some are hardcore brain guys, right? They believe that the brain is everything. And some people are still saying, what is this thing there? We believe in the heart, not in the brain, right? The other issue of the spectrum is normal versus abnormal. What is normal and what is abnormal? And we've been skirting around these issues essentially. So, in terms of the mind-body issue, it is difficult for people to understand that really, of course, our brain can be affected by maybe slow virus, and maybe that's why we're getting, Alzheimer, and we are looking for reason why we're getting Parkinson. But of course, there are other ways in which the brain can change. So what Tania is saying here, I am actually having some very concrete steps, and I'm actually affecting the thickness of the cortex. Once she says that, the whole room wakes up because they say, my God, my brain is actually changing. It's not just some general statement. So I think that's where we really are. We are in the business of changing brains in a certain way, of course. Okay. Now we can change brains in an Orwellian scenario, right? Big Brother or whatever. But we can also change it in an organized way at a critical period of time and having educational program. We just have to identify, first of all, in the R-Doc fashion, we have to identify the psychological constructs which are meaningful. So I think, we already mentioned it. We have empathy, we have dehumanization, we have agency, we have identity, we have to define it clearly. Sacred values, what are values, okay? So the second issue is that we really, I was delighted we really have come down to the frontal circuits, okay? I'm sorry that we didn't have Etienne there. You were the missing element in this puzzle. But that circuit, whatever the social brain, the orbitofrontal ventromedial part, the lateral part, the amygdala, and the striatum, these are really the key structures, okay? And of course that bottleneck of, how many neurons. I was actually struck, and I never thought about it. It's so few neurons are really controlling us, holding us by the neck, where essentially the neuromodulators, we are held by the neck by those primitive systems, okay? Our brain, the prefrontal cortex is growing, and we have those, how many do you have? 50,000. 50,000, that's nothing. It's like, and all the catecholamines, all this soup, that we are swimming in is really coming from that. So the pharmacological thing was very meaningful to me because it's probably the only causal thing that I can see at the moment, which is fairly simple to grasp. You give somebody amphetamine, he's a different person. That's it. So these are things. So, I don't think we can put a perpetrator so much. This may not be the approach. First, because we are all perpetrators, potentially, okay? The issue is really to look at the condition under which, you can become, a perpetrator. And the last point is really that I found interesting is the fragility of our moral reason. Because, the plasticity of the brain has two aspects. One is the positive aspect. You can learn, you can do everything. It's wonderful. On the other hand, your moral reasoning is extremely fragile. And I think we have to really look at those issues. We now have actually tools to look at it. So,
can we, just a minute. I'd like to answer. You say that. I think we have to recognize that normally we like to kill. We are made to kill. We are made to destroy the other. And we have been educated from the beginning of our life not to do it. So finally, the problem is motivation. And the motivation, we are working with our reward circuitry. And we have been told not to go in that direction. And finally, what happens to people who take drugs of abuse, or who have problems with, who become perpetrators? It's just because they have had a problem in their motivation system and the regulation of their motivation system. They accept to take drugs of abuse, even if they know they are going to die because of them, because to have terrible problems. And maybe perpetrators do that because there is nothing else to do. Thus, their motivation system is ill.
Okay, so yeah, I think that the question of decision, for which Etienne is working so much, is really an important thing. I have a few words to say after you, Etienne.
Okay, thank you. I would like to add something to Edmund. So I really agree with what you said about these three systems which drive behavior. So the habit system, the value system, and the what you call the reasoning system. I call it the rule system, but I think we talk about the same thing. And so these three systems compete in one sense to drive behavior. And this is very important, competition, which means that if you are in a situation where uncertainty is very large, and meaning that your value system is really uncertain about what is, let us say, good or bad, what could happen is that then either the habit system or the rule system start to drive behavior in priority. Or the rules are something which are learned, and you can. So when you are in a situation where uncertainty is large, your value system may be very uncertain. So not to have any more effect on driving behavior, and then the rule system. So you can learn any rules, and you can have these rules to drive the behavior of anybody. So you can teach very bad rules, or you can conform to rules in a society which are beneficial for everybody, but also rules which are detrimental for human being.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy that Etienne came because he made this proposal at the last meeting concerning the capacity of the rule system to override the value system. Now, let me just say one word from my point of view. Yesterday night, between 11 o'clock and midnight, France 2 projected a film. Did anybody in the room see that? You did, yeah. I really advise that many of you see this film because you can get it on TV on Plus for 1 week. C'est pas Plus, c'est quelque chose d'autre. Anyway, this is an absolutely terrible, remarkable, but terrible film concerning the children of war, the topic I was talking about yesterday. And you should see this film because they have been very brave, and it really describes that the Daesh, how the Daesh is now taking not only, as I thought, and as I showed for Uganda, children from 9 to 13, but they take children even at 4. There was an example of 3 brothers and sisters, 2 boys and a girl, aged 4 to 7, something like this, which were captured, and they were obliged, the girl was obliged to cut the throat, and they were 4 to 7, and the 2 boys to kill. So please look at this film, because we discussed yesterday, and you know, Tania, after my talk, said, well, empathy and these things, it's not only a 7 to 12, but theory of mind should be, it's also very early. Yes, of course. There are many stages in the capacity of the children and adolescent and even adult brain to actually deal with these mechanisms that we are now understanding a little bit. But it's absolutely fascinating to me. I just nearly couldn't sleep. That these, and it's probably one of the first times in human history that people take so young children to make perpetrators of them. And given what we know and what we have heard, and we know the literature, not only of Tania, but the world literature concerning brain plasticity, not plasticity, but brain modifications induced by activity, even thinking. right? Mathematician brain has a different structure. That these hundreds of thousands of children now in the world, which are being made into perpetrators, they will be there. They will still be there as adults, as the two adults I showed. So I think, Greti said a few minutes ago, we should not look at prevention. Yes, we have to be very careful. And your example of autism was very good. We should not pretend we are making prevention or training if we don't know the mechanism. And we are all very modest about that. But at the same time, I think we cannot let this go on. And this is one of the topics that with Jean-Paul Costa next year in the Institut des Droits de l'Homme we want to tackle, because they had 2 years ago, what the Institut des Droits de l'Homme does here, every year they bring 200,000 to 400,000 jurists from all over the world, all the countries of the world, into sessions. And 2 years ago they had a special session concerning children. And I think that for the future plans, this I propose that we do look not only at what happens in the brain of the Daesh guys, but also what happens in the brain of these kids, particularly, who are made into perpetrators, in the frame eventually of making an international protecting rule, which we should try. So, sorry for my empathic participation, but I was absolutely fascinated by what I saw.
I'd like to just challenge a little bit the statement made by Tassin that we're built to kill, or that some animals are. Most animals are built not to kill, in the sense that they form a dominance hierarchy, and it's in the interest of their genes not to kill so much, not to at least risk their own lives. So most animals have mechanisms for agreeing who's going to be the victor and not injuring each other. Now, the implication of that is quite interesting, I think, for this area. It implies that we may also have built into us not just tribalism, but mechanisms for resolving conflicts, in which we agree that one group does one thing and another group does something else. And so I think we shouldn't neglect the possibility of political discussions here with the outgroups, and wondering whether one can get some resolution that, again, builds on some fundamental part of our biology.
Thank you. No.
And I would
Tania, and then we will ask the room if they have some comments.
So I would like to comment on your question about the value, and it seems to me there is a complexity of layers to this question. I think first we heard a lot of people talking about value, but I think on different levels of value. When you talk about value, it's decision values, like, do I like the Jews? Do I like the, or Disney, and whether they drive my, decisions. Now, if we talk about sacred value, that's on a complete different level of construction, because you need a kind of belief system, a cultural value. If you talk about ethical values, again, this is another way of talking about values. And I would agree that we know already quite a lot about decision value and decision making in neuroscience, thanks to your work, to Antonio Rangel's work and so on. I think social neuroscience is now marrying decision science, and so we know now, for example, that from insular signal and empathy weightings, we can predict donation behavior through the loop of insula informing medial prefrontal cortex and then having a decision value. So I think here we are on a right track. We see more and more how emotions can then be translated into decision, how when you have to inhibit your emotion, how DLPFC comes in and inhibits. But what we don't know at all, I would say, is where are these identity values stored? How do they come about? Is it a part of episodic memory? Is it a part of a complete different? And how would they be top-down loaded into the brain? Where do they come from? And override these other decision circuitry. And I think really this is an edge. We have no clue, I would say. In psychology, we know a lot about sacred value and how, but we don't know how that, and I think that would be great to, if someone is free to have a new program, this would be a great program to engage.
Thank you for the suggestion. Maybe the audience would like to comment.
Yeah, just one little question here to Etienne. You mentioned the role of uncertainty, and what is the role of uncertainty there in this rule, versus value, conflict? Yeah.
When value is uncertain, the rule system can overrule.
Value are fragile.
He says values are fragile and they are.
No, because it just ties in again for the interdisciplinary discussion to what James Berger was talking about, the concept of uncertainty. Yeah.
The question of ethical value is very complex. The question of ethical value is very complex, of course, and I think there is a mixture about what we will call, let us say, emotional value with ethical value, and about rules. There is a mixture of two in the ethical value, which makes them very complex. What I say about uncertainty is that values, I mean, the construct of value is probably very complex, and values are fragile, and they are very dependent about the uncertainty of the situation we are. The more the situation is uncertain in terms of whether, for example, about the intention of other people I am interacting with, and so on. You may have different value, but they come from they could come from very uncertain situation that makes them very fragile. And the more these values are fragile, the less they will drive behavior, basically. And the more you rely on rules, the rule system, which is
okay. Several hands here over here. Okay.
I think that when we begin okay. Unfortunately, I believe that if we begin to think in the direction of prevention, then among the things that we have learned is that we have to start also thinking about curbing or inhibiting freedom of speech and education for those people who are teaching children and educating them in a direction that we think is not moral. For example, apropos of what Berthold just told us, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Arab Muslim children are being trained from kindergarten to carry pseudo guns, and their purpose is their sacred value, which is being inculcated, is to kill Jews. Now, I do not like the idea of my great-grandchildren, when they grow up, that have to face the adults who have been so trained. Because it is not just a physical danger, which I think that we have been facing for many, many generations, but the idea of facing people for whom it is a moral value to destroy us is a rather frightening thing. And yet, on the other hand, as we heard yesterday, the ideas such as freedom of speech and education are values that we all hold. And to inhibit or curb those in others because what they are teaching is unacceptable for us is a different kind of problem, I think, that we need to face. And those of us who have psychological training are aware that really in terms of the moral agency that Freud taught us about, which is the superego, it is a mechanism, the content of which is neutral. We can theoretically teach children that good is to steal and to kill, and that bad is to allow enemies to continue to live. There is no rule about the mechanism of superego control that forces us to think of it as being necessarily moral. I think I made my point.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take more comments and questions from the. Okay.
I just wanted to challenge as well the notion that we like to kill those here with military training, especially combat experience, know that killing a human being doesn't come easy. It takes indoctrination. You have to learn systematically that the enemy is not in your group. and doesn't deserve to live. And this it doesn't come so natural. I know this is a long story, but also as a clinician, we get soldiers with combat experience and post-traumatic stress disorder. So I would make a difference between killing and killing another human being.
We're just mentioning the time issue here, so brief comments.
Can you speak very loud and close to the microphone, please?
Yes, I hope you can hear me. In the gangs that I work with, one of the things that's... can you hear me or no? Yeah, one of the things that I've always been surprised by is they always teach the people who are going to do the killing that they can escape. And they work a little bit hard on this, trying to develop a system of escape, when in fact they know they won't escape. They'll either get to the legal system or they'll die physically in combat. So this is another issue for you to think about. How do you tackle that issue?
I am a little bit skeptic that syndrome E only exists in Homo sapiens, and I agree with what Edmund said, that we should also get some insight, at least from studying animal behavior. I think it is very possible that syndrome E also exists in the great apes. For example, the culture groups, like different groups with accumulative culture, is widely observed in chimpanzee, orangutan, and gorillas, and some other old monkey. And there are also ritualized behavior that is observed in chimpanzees. So I think primatology can probably also contribute a lot to syndrome E study. Another thing is that if syndrome E is really unique to Homo sapiens, did that first come out in terms of human evolution, like what kind of, which hominin species, like is that, well, but that is of course more difficult to study. We only have bones, and that's all. For example, in Homo naledi that is discovered in South Africa in the caves, like most of them are young, like the youngster. It might be a mass killing, or it might be a ritualized behavior, and no one knows. So perhaps we should also take the human evolution, not only the human history with written history, into concern of studying syndrome E and identity.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, no more questions? Well, then I think no more comments from the round table? Yeah.
We are not made to kill, we are made to fight, and in some cases it can go up to kill. I agree with you that in certain societies, in animal societies, they wouldn't kill, but in others, they will. You see, it depends.
So that's interesting, the discussion this morning, because actually it introduces for the future, maybe, it's a suggestion, the fact that although it looks a bit far-fetched, we could put the question in an evolutionary dimension, maybe not only restrict animal, and that would be of interest maybe to some of our colleagues of different disciplines, which are also looking at this question from the history of humankind, something. Okay. So I think it may be time now to close this roundtable, and thank you, and come to the general conclusions. So we are going to go and sit there and listen to Itzhak Fried and Professor Grete Myrdal, that I would like to thank personally before I leave the floor. I stand up, Grete, to thank you so much. Because you are leading this institute, and you have towards us such an attitude of opening, which corresponds, of course, to the spirit of an institute of advanced studies, but also you are adding such an incredibly nice human dimension to that. Thank you very much.